My brother's bachelor party was already halfway through when my father pulled me aside, smiled like he was doing me a favor, and told me they weren't paying for my college anymore. Not that they ever really had. But that night, standing outside a steakhouse in downtown Columbus, while laughter and clinking glasses filtered through the glass behind me, something finalized. The door closed. I heard it shut even though it made no sound. My name is Nolan, and for most of my life, the word responsible was the nicest thing my family ever called me, and also the most damaging. It started so early that I can't actually point to the moment it became the pattern. By the time I was in middle school, my younger brother Cody was already the one who got the longer hug when our parents came home from work. His soccer games had both of them on the sidelines, with lawn chairs and a cooler. My track meets, the ones where I actually placed, usually had one parent, sometimes none, depending on whether Cody had practice. I told myself it was normal. Kids tell themselves a lot of things to survive their own households. Our dad worked in commercial real estate and made good money. Our mum did part-time bookkeeping for a dental practice and spent the rest of her time managing Cody's schedule, like he was a professional athlete with sponsorships on the line. He wasn't a bad person, my brother. He was just the one they'd decided to build. I was the one they assumed would build himself. The laptop situation was probably when I first understood this clearly. I was a sophomore in high school, needed something decent for AP classes and a coding elective I'd gotten into. I asked my dad. He said, "Look around the house. There's that old Dell in the basement. Make it work." 2 weeks later, Cody mentioned he wanted a MacBook for video editing, a hobby he'd had for maybe 3 months. My parents drove him to the Apple store on a Saturday and bought it same day. They came home laughing about the parking situation at the mall. The Dell in the basement had a cracked hinge and took 11 minutes to boot. I didn't say anything. I cleaned up the old machine, replaced the thermal paste myself after watching YouTube tutorials, and made it work for 2 years. What I remember most from that period isn't the frustration. It's the silence at dinner when I mentioned I'd gotten a 94 on the AP Comp Sci exam. My mom said, "That's great, honey," and immediately asked Cody if his coach had responded about the spring tournament. Nobody insulted me directly. That's the part people don't understand when I try to explain it. There were no cruel words, no dramatic confrontations, no clear villain speech. It was the pauses, the glances that didn't land on me, the way the room reorganized itself around my brother without anyone deciding to do it, like gravity, like weather. You don't argue with weather. Senior year of high school, I had 3 college acceptance letters, including one to Ohio State's engineering program. I sat down with my parents at the kitchen table and asked about financial support. Not a free ride. I knew better. I was asking if they could help with even a portion of tuition so I wouldn't have to take on the full loan weight alone. My dad looked at the letters, the way you look at a menu at a restaurant you didn't choose. He said, "Nolan, you're capable. You've always figured things out. That's your strength." My mom nodded and said she had full confidence in me. 3 days later, my brother announced he was thinking about going to a private university in Nashville. Within the hour, my parents were at the kitchen table with a notepad, calculating payment plans, talking about dorm quality, asking about Greek life and campus culture, and whether the school had good football. My mom pulled up the campus tour schedule on her laptop. My dad got on the phone with their financial advisor. I was sitting in the living room, close enough to hear everything, invisible as furniture. That night, I did the math on what my loans would look like at graduation. I did the math again. Then I closed the laptop, walked to my room, and accepted my enrollment at Ohio State without telling anyone. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't need a send-off. I packed 2 bags, arranged my own housing through a roommate matching app, and moved into a 3-bedroom apartment with 2 guys I'd never met. One of them became one of my closest friends. The other one microwaved fish at 11 at night, and we never really recovered from that. The first year was harder than I expected, and I had expected it to be hard. I worked 20 hours a week at a university IT help desk, went to class and came home to study until I ran out of focus. I applied for every scholarship I could find that wasn't already flooded with 10,000 applicants. I won 2 of them. They weren't large, but they mattered. Updates about Cody came through aunts and cousins who didn't know they were delivering them. My parents covered his rent at a nice apartment off campus in Nashville. They paid for his meal plan upgrade. They flew down for parents' weekend and posted pictures on Facebook. Cody in front of his dorm, my parents beaming. The whole family assembled except for one person who was never mentioned. I stopped scrolling those posts after a while. Not out of bitterness, exactly. More like self-preservation. You stop touching the thing that burns you. What I focused on instead was the work in front of me. I was studying electrical engineering and I was decent at it. But I had a professor in my junior year a dry and demanding man who ran the advanced circuits lab like it was a graduate seminar, who told me after one exam that I had better natural intuition for systems-level thinking than almost anyone he'd taught in 15 years. That comment did something to me. Not because I needed his approval. I'd trained myself out of needing anyone's approval, but because it confirmed something I'd suspected quietly for years. I wasn't just surviving. I was actually good at this. I graduated with honours, a 3.8, and a recommendation letter from that same professor that I later learned helped me land my first position. I got a job at a mid-sized infrastructure technology firm headquartered in Columbus. They designed and managed the operational systems for large commercial facilities, airports, convention centres, hospital complexes. The kind of back-end work nobody sees but everybody depends on. I told my parents about the job, said that's wonderful, and asked if I'd called my grandmother yet. My dad said good, sounds stable, and went back to watching the game. I didn't call them often after that. The work was unglamorous at first. I was doing site assessments and writing technical documentation for systems most of my colleagues had already stopped caring about. But I kept showing up early, and I kept asking questions that apparently most junior engineers didn't ask, because within 18 months, I was being pulled into larger project consultations. By my third year, I was leading a team on a contract for a regional airport expansion. By my fifth year, I was a senior project engineer with equity in the firm, and a stake in a separate infrastructure consultancy I'd co-founded with 2 colleagues. Nobody in my family knew any of this. I hadn't hidden it, exactly. I just hadn't announced it. I'd stopped expecting that news about my life would land with any weight in those conversations, so I stopped offering it. The silence went both directions eventually, and I let it. Then, in October, I got a voicemail from my mother. Cody was getting married. The wedding was in April. It was going to be held at a venue outside Columbus, a restored historic estate that did upscale events. She hoped I would come. She said it in that particular tone parents use when they're asking a question, but framing it like they're extending an invitation to something you'd be lucky to attend. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about that. I sat with the voicemail for 3 days. I had no anger toward my brother. We'd stayed cordial over the years in that cautious way adult siblings do when they were never really close. His fiancée, a woman named Priya who worked in healthcare administration, seemed genuinely warm on the few occasions I'd been around her. She wasn't part of the old dynamic. She didn't deserve to have me absent from the wedding because of it, so I went. The venue was 40 minutes outside the city, a late 19th century estate that had been converted into an event facility about 12 years ago. Long gravel drive, restored farmhouse main building, a carriage house that had been opened up and renovated into a reception space. It seated around 200, and it was almost full. String lights everywhere. Flowers I couldn't name. The kind of evening where even the air seems to have been arranged by someone. I arrived late enough to find a spot near the back of the outdoor ceremony area and sat quietly through the service. My parents were up front, dressed carefully, looking like the parents of the groom at a wedding, which they were. My mother cried during the vows. My father looked proud. I watched them and felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not even that old familiar ache. Just a kind of distance that had become so comfortable. Over the years it barely registered anymore. The reception was inside the carriage house. I found a table near the edge of the room and settled in with a glass of water, watching the crowd move through its phases. Introductions, toasts, the first dance. The room smelled like gardenias and wood smoke from an outdoor fire pit they'd set up near the side entrance. I almost didn't notice it. I wasn't looking for it. But I was holding the evening's printed program, the kind with the couple's names, the venue details, the evening's order of events. And at the bottom, in small type, was the name of the event management company that had coordinated the entire evening, Trident Peak Event Services. I stared at it for a moment. Trident Peak was a company my consulting firm had helped restructure 8 months earlier. They'd been over-leveraged, mismanaged at the operational level, hemorrhaging mid-size contracts. We'd been brought in by their board to evaluate, restructure, and stabilize. In the process, our consultancy had converted a portion of our fee into an equity stake, which was fairly standard in turnaround work. I held a personal equity position in Trident Peak and sat on its advisory board. More relevantly, I knew exactly what had happened to this particular account. Earlier in the year, when Trident Peak was still in the middle of its restructuring, several of its booked events had come under review because of vendor contract disputes and payment irregularities from the previous management. My team had spent 2 weeks untangling those accounts. I remembered this one, not because of anything personal, but because it had been flagged as a high-visibility event with a tight timeline and a client who had already made a significant deposit. The decision to honor the contract rather than restructure it away had been mine. I'd signed off on it personally. I'd saved this wedding without knowing it was my brother's wedding. I sat with that information for a moment, and then I looked across the room at my parents, who were laughing with relatives near the bar, and I felt something move through me that I couldn't immediately name. I wasn't planning to say anything. That's true. I had no speech prepared, no moment I was building toward. I'd come to watch my brother get married and then drive home and go back to my life. But then Priya found me. She'd been making rounds through the room, stopping at each table, the way attentive hosts do at their own wedding. When she reached my table and introduced herself, I stood and told her my name. I said I was Cody's brother. Her expression shifted in a way that I noticed but couldn't immediately read. She said she knew who I was. I said we hadn't met many times, we probably hadn't had much chance to talk. She said no, that's not. And then she paused. She picked up the program from my table, looked at the bottom line, and looked back at me. She said, Nolan Ashby. She said it like she was confirming something. She said, you're the one who approved the account continuation in February, aren't you? It wasn't really a question. I said yes. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, I need to tell you something. She said that in February, when Trident Peak had gone through its restructuring, they had received a notice that their event might be cancelled due to the account disputes. She and Cody had been terrified. They'd already paid the majority of their deposit. They'd sent invitations. The venue was central to everything they'd planned. For 2 weeks, they hadn't known if the wedding was happening. And then they'd received a letter from the new advisory board confirming that the account had been reviewed and would be honoured in full. She said she never knew who specifically had made that call, until now. I didn't know what to say. I told her it had been a business decision, that I'd reviewed several accounts that month, that I hadn't known whose wedding it was. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, Does your family know what you do? I said. They know I work in engineering. She was quiet again. Then she excused herself, and I watched her cross the room toward my parents. I didn't follow. I stayed at my table and watched from a distance as she spoke to my mother and then my father. I watched my mother's expression change, that specific kind of change where a face doesn't know what it's doing, where the muscles are receiving information the brain hasn't processed yet. My father looked across the room at me, and I met his eyes for the first time in what felt like years. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he hadn't expected to find. My mother came first. She crossed the room quickly, the way parents move when they're embarrassed and trying to cover it with action. She reached my table and sat down without asking. She said, Priya told us. She said it like those 3 words were supposed to do a lot of work. I said, told you what specifically? She said, about your company, about what you've been doing, about the wedding. I said, what about it? She said, Nolan, why didn't you tell us? I looked at her. I thought about the brochures I'd spread on the kitchen table at 17. I thought about the Dell in the basement. I thought about 100 dinners where my sentences had simply not arrived. I didn't say any of that. I said, I wasn't sure you'd be interested. She flinched. It was small, but I saw it. My dad arrived a few minutes later. He sat down across from me, and for the first time in my adult memory, he didn't have anything immediately ready to say. He looked older than I'd been tracking. The years had moved across him while I'd been looking elsewhere. He said, son. I waited. He said, we owe you more than an apology. He said it plainly, without decoration, which was actually the most meaningful version of those words he could have chosen. I told him I appreciated that. I meant it. What happened next was not a dramatic reconciliation. It wasn't a screaming match either. My brother came over and sat with us. And for the first time in our lives, we talked like adults who had chosen to be present rather than people fulfilling a family role. Cody said he'd had no idea about any of it. The restructuring, my company, the account. He looked genuinely shaken. He said he was sorry. Not for the wedding logistics. For the years. For the way things had been. I believed him. Or I believed that he believed it, which was enough for now. My parents said things that night that were partly genuine and partly shaped by the shock of realizing what they hadn't paid attention to. I've thought about that distinction a lot since then. Regret that arrives because of consequences is real regret, but it's not the same as the regret that arrives from reflection. They were experiencing both, I think, in different proportions, and I couldn't entirely tell which was which. I wasn't sure they could either. What I told them was this. I told them that I'd spent a long time wanting them to see me, that the wanting had eventually become exhausting, and I'd put it down, not in anger, but because I had to in order to keep moving. I told them that what I'd built for myself, not for them, and not to prove anything to anyone. I told them that the wedding tonight, whatever strange coincidence had made it into what it was, wasn't something I had planned or engineered. I had simply made a business decision in February and come to a wedding in April, and the two things had turned out to be connected. I told them that forgiveness was something I was capable of. I also told them that trust was something different, something slower, something that would take whatever time it took, if it happened at all. My mother started crying again. My father didn't, but he looked like he was somewhere private inside himself, somewhere the evening had put him. Cody and Priya danced their last dance of the night while the string lights dimmed slightly, and the music slowed and the room breathed out. I sat at my table and watched and felt, I think for the first time in a long time, that I was actually present. Not performing contentment, not managing distance, not monitoring the room for exits, just there. I drove home alone that night. I-70 West was empty and the city came up gradually out of the flat dark, the skyline low and familiar. I had the windows down and the radio off. In the months since we have spoken, my parents and I, carefully, in increments. My father called me 2 weeks after the wedding and asked if I would have lunch with him. We sat at a diner near his office and talked for 2 hours. It was sometimes awkward and sometimes surprisingly normal. He asked me questions about my work that suggested he had done some reading first, which was unexpectedly touching. He didn't try to fill the years with a single conversation. Neither did I. My mother sends texts more often now. Sometimes I respond quickly. Sometimes I take a few days. She's learning to wait. I'm learning to reach back. Cody and I have talked more in the past 6 months than in the previous 10 years combined. He's different with Priya than he was as the kid I grew up beside. More considered, more present, less shaped by the dynamic that made both of us into versions of ourselves we didn't exactly choose. We don't talk about the past much. We mostly talk about now. I find that's enough. I'm not interested in being owed anything. The debt isn't one that can be repaid in the currency people usually try to use. Attention, retroactive pride, apologies after the consequences have arrived. What I know now that I didn't fully understand at 22 is that the life I built during all those years of being overlooked is entirely mine. No one helped with it. No one can take partial credit. Every decision, every late night, every recovered scholarship application, every contract I stayed up to read properly, that was me, working alone, and what it produced was something no family meeting could have built on my behalf. I used to think success would feel like proof, that when the moment came where people understood what I'd done, I'd feel vindicated in some satisfying and final way. That's not what happened. What I felt instead, sitting at that table in a renovated carriage house while the reception moved around me, was simply that I had become someone whose opinion of himself did not require outside confirmation. That had happened gradually over years in a way I hadn't entirely noticed. The wedding just let me see it clearly. My parents had believed they were doing Cody a favor by giving him everything. I think in the years since, they've come to understand that the unfairness they built into our childhood shaped both of us in ways they didn't intend and didn't see. My brother got support and very little friction. I got friction and almost no support. What each of us developed in response to those conditions is now visible in who we are at 30. I don't know what the right thing to do with all of that is, exactly. I don't think it resolves cleanly. I think it's just something you carry at a manageable weight for the rest of your life, and try not to pass on to anyone else. What I know is that the boy who sat in a living room, listening to his parents plan someone else's future chose, at 17, to stop waiting for permission. That choice was the real beginning of everything. Not the scholarship, not the equity stake, not the account I approved in February without knowing whose name was on it. The real beginning was the morning I enrolled at Ohio State alone and decided quietly, without drama or announcement, that the rest of my life was going to be built on what I could do, not on what anyone was willing to give me. I'm still building it. That has always been enough.